Okay, so in this video I want to go through how to draw graphs and tables, but we'll have to do a little bit of background information first, namely looking at the types of data. Before we do that, here we have a nice flowchart of the different types of data that we encounter. We have already looked at qualitative and quantitative, and those being discrete and continuous, but it's also worth having a look at the subtypes, those being binary, nominal, ordinal, that are part of the discrete classification, or interval ratio, which is generally what we will encounter in day-to-day lives and in terms of graphing that sort of data. So I don't expect you to know all of these, but it's useful to know what kinds of data are out there, particularly when we have to actually graph this data and represent it in a lab report. So let's quickly go through some of these. As I said, the majority of our focus will be on these two, which are all quantitative data. So if we have discrete data, it has a limited number of values. It can be countable. In terms of continuous data, it theoretically has no limit. It generally has units, and it's not counted. The other distinction is that we can have part numbers. So we can have fractions, we can have decimal points. They're not specific to whole numbers. So in terms of what sort of graphs should we be drawing and when, well, if we're looking at a line graph, it's generally to do with experimental data, in that something is being manipulated or changed, and it's often the independent variable. The x-axis is continuous, so we can have parts of, and often it's something that's measured over time. Sometimes we can have the y-axis being measured in time, but that will be more to do with a column graph instead. So if we have time along the x-axis, chances are it's going to be a line graph. For a column graph, this is generally when we have discrete categories, categories that are not numerical or continuous in value, and we're often looking at how many there are, a frequency diagram perhaps. Note that between the columns, or the categories rather, there is a gap. So you can see we've left spaces between the two, and we've demarcated where the categories begin and end, or at least the labeling, with ticks, and the ticks face outwards. And we'll look at that a bit more closely when we look at creating graphs. So here is a histogram. You'll notice that there are no gaps between the columns. It's looking at frequency, or how often something occurs. In this case, it is numerical, but it's not continuous, the scale down the bottom. In terms of a scatter plot, neither variable, neither the x or the y, is being manipulated. Most often we will use a scatter plot to show data from a correlational study, or looking to analyze the correlation or the association between variables. And you can see in this case we have quite a strong correlation. The majority of points are gathered around a central line, or a central point, and in this graph a line of best fit has been added. So in both cases, or both axes of data, are continuous. So in terms of what we would see on a graph, we have the title, and if it's an experimental design, then it would mention both the dependent and independent variables in the title. Make sure your title is nice and descriptive. If you are doing X versus Y as a title, then that's completely inappropriate and doesn't really describe what your data is representing. Your scales on each axis must go up by the same amount, or I should say that the gap between each value on your axes must be the same amount. So if you're going up by tens, If you're going up by 5s, if you're going up by 2s, it all must be the same amount. Both axes should have labels, and if there are units, then they should be in brackets next to them. Remember that your y-axis is your dependent variable and your x-axis is your independent variable. X-axis is the variable that you are changing, y-axis is the variable that you are measuring. If you are having a line graph and there is more than one set of data, then you will need to have some sort of a key or a legend that indicates which data set is which. Also applicable if you are using a column graph. Now, in a test or an exam, chances are you will be given raw data. So you won't be given the averages, you won't be given the means or the modes, etc. You'll probably just be given some raw data points, and then you'll be asked to graph it. Now, if we have a look at how the table is organized, there's a certain general rule of thumb that we encounter. So the x-axis is generally the first column, and the y-axis is generally the second column. So the variable that you are changing, the variable that you have been measuring. Also note that the units are included in the heading of your columns. If it isn't an experimental design and it's a scatter plot or a correlational data that you're dealing with, the same rule tends to apply. This set of data will go on the x-axis, this set of data will be labeled on the y-axis. Occasionally you will get a table of results that looks like this. Generally we'll see this in a mathematics context. So in this example we have the x-axis data that's going across all up in even increments. Your y-axis being below, this will still go on your y-axis, your vertical axis, and your x-axis on the horizontal as you normally would. Never trust anyone who doesn't label their axes. So when it comes time to publishing our data, we need to make sure it is done in a particular way. The American Psychological Association has specific criteria as to how this should be done. We're currently at edition 7, which I believe came out in 2020 or 2019. So when it comes to graphing data, there's a number of things we need to take into consideration. It's always laid out with a figure number. So we like to think of a graph as being a diagram of sorts, and so we call it a figure. The first figure is given a 1, second 2, etc. You'll notice that the figure is bolded, there is no full stops after it. The title is underneath and is italicized, and we say it's in title case. So you'll see each of the first letters is in capitals, except for the of and the ands and the ths. They're not too important. If you are including a note, so maybe a small explanation, the word note will be in italics. There'll be a full stop next to it. The description that comes afterwards will be in normal font, and there will be a full stop at the end. Note that there's no full stop here as part of the title. Note that there is double spacing between all the text, so between the figure and the heading, and the note down the bottom. Ideally, I would be putting these headings or titles or labels rather at the bottom. So somewhat higher I would have underneath the column, not at the top. All text should be left aligned. Font size should be between 8 and 14. The default setting of 12 is generally fine. Whatever font you are using in your report, it should be the same as what goes on your graph or table. Looking at column graphs, in terms of a line graph, if you have more than one set of data, you should of course have a key or a legend. In any graph, you should have ticks along the axes and they are pointing outwards. So you clearly know where that numerical value is extending up to or across. If you're having a column graph and there's numerical values, they should be in the middle and you should still have your ticks either side of the columns. In terms of tables, you should have minimal lines. Again, they should be double spaced. Titles, just like in graphs, should be very descriptive, and each table is also numbered. This is a very simple table. Again, we have in bold table 1, title case of the title, so no capitals on the ands. And we only put in the minimal amount of lines. So we have only 3 horizontal lines, 2 that indicate the headings of each column, and the bottom line that is signaling that this is the end of the table. There are no vertical lines whatsoever. So when you're drawing these in Microsoft Word, you'll need to erase those lines. So in a bit more detail, we should have a look at, again, any notes down the bottom, italics, full stop, and then whatever your note may be, all in double spacing. If you are constructing your graph in Microsoft Word, you'll see these faint dotted lines. These will not show when you print them out. Same deal as the graphs, double spaced, left aligned. You see the headings here all centered, but your descriptions here are all left aligned. Let's have a look at how to construct tables in Microsoft Word. Okay, so here we have some information that I want to put into my results section. I have my table number all ready to go. My title is in italics. Here I have the information that's in the table. I've just had it at the default setting, so everything's left aligned. What I do want to do is put this into double spacing. There we go. And I also want to center my headings and my values. There we go, so that's all done. The next thing is to get rid of the lines. So I want to select my table, click on Table Design, go across to Borders, and I want no border. So that's taken the borders off of everything. What you do get left behind are grey scaffolding lines, and they do not show up when you print your work off. So I can turn grid lines off, or I can turn grid lines back on. That's just to help me see how things are arranged. So let's go back to Table Design, and I want to insert borders across the top. There we go, and also across the bottom of the top row, and one border along the bottom row. There we go, and that is my table formatted. Right, so I want to first start off with a line graph. I've got some very basic data here about bacterial numbers growing over a certain amount of time. I'm just going to select this column. I'm not going to select both. I'm just going to select the dependent variable. I'll go up to Insert, and I will choose a line graph because it's being conducted over time. Just choose that one, and it's looking good at this stage, but there's some adjustments we need to make. First thing is I want to get rid of this heading. So got rid of that because we're going to have our own title across the top anyway. Next thing I want to do is make sure our axes are showing up properly. So I've just clicked on the x-axis there. I do want a solid line, and that should come in dark already. You'll also notice there's no ticks, so I want to put in some ticks so we know what our numbers are pointing to. Let's go tick marks, major type, outside. Now that's all very well and good, but I actually want the ticks in the middle as well. So I'll pick minor type and go outside. That's looking a lot better. So I've got some midpoints that are shown up there, and I've got the main ticks for all our days. Now I shouldn't have any lines going across like this. So if I just select those, I've got the little blue balls on the end, hit delete, they will disappear. But I need to rule in my axes for the Y axes. So let's go back to fill and line. I've selected those. I want a solid line, and it has put that in for me quite nicely. Let's click on that and go back to putting our ticks in. Tick marks outside. In this case, it isn't worth me putting in the minor tick marks, not like I did on the x-axis. If I did put them in, it'll look like that. The only other things that are missing are our axes titles. So if I click up on this little icon, I can get my axes titles. It's not ticked by default, which is very strange, so let's put a tick in there. And if I double click on the label, so let's call this time in days. So I've got our units in brackets. Our y-axis, number of bacteria. I could probably go through and change the text because all the text seems to be in a lighter font, and it is. So by selecting the text or the numbers, I've gone to text options. I want to make that nice and dark. There we go. Let's do that with the labels as well. Color, nice and black, and same there. Okay, and let's also turn that to black as well. Nice. So that is our APA standard line graph. Let's go to the column graphs. So here we have a list of students and their NAPLAN writing scores, and I want this just in a very basic column graph. So I'm going to have to select both columns, insert, column graph. So let's choose that one. It's got our names down the bottom. So in this case, I'm keen to change our solid blue to an outlined black. So I want a solid line, but I want no fill. There we go. I also want these horizontal lines gone. So I'll click on those and delete them. Let's put in our lines for our axes, because again, these don't appear by default. So I've put in my horizontal axes, and let's have a look at our tick marks. So major type, outside. Minor type, outside. With the column graph, it might be best just to remove the major type. Keep the minor type so that we know that that is pointing to each column. We'll put in our vertical axes now as well. So line, we want a solid line, and we want it in black. Yes, it is. And we also want our tick marks. So we'll click on our Y column, tick marks, major. Pretty good. Alright, so that's all looking good, but we don't have our labels in. So we'll go up to axis titles, and while I'm here, I'm going to get rid of chart title. Right, we've deleted that. axes title here will be students, and axes title here will be NAPLAN writing score. And that is our column graph done. And now to our scatter plot. So I have 19 students, I have their physics test mark, and I have their NAPLAN numeracy mark. So how am I going to graph these? Well, let's select just these two columns. I won't select the students. I'll go insert and I will choose simple scatter plot. So that's what I'm after. It doesn't have all the students down the bottom, but I do need to change an awful lot of this. You can see that all the data is hanging up in this top right hand corner. Ideally I want to spread this out a bit and get rid of all this white space down here. The first thing we'll do is get rid of our unnecessary title. Our axes, line, solid line, nice and black, vertical, also a solid line. I want to get rid of the grid on here as well. There we go. In terms of our axes labels, we're going to need to put those in. So axes titles, put a tick in there. This is of course our physics test. Physics test scores. NAPLAN numeracy scores. I change the color of these dots. Can I get that? There we go. Okay, so clicked on that axis. Let's go to our ticks. Major type outside. Don't need the minor type this time. Y-axis, major type, outside. I want to try and start my numbering off slightly differently. So if I click on my x-axis data and I go to my options, there is no minimum, so I want to change this minimum to 20, and you'll see that that has pushed all of that along. So I'd clicked on my x-axis data, this was set to 0, I changed it to 20. I could, if I wanted to, change it to 25. I'm quite happy with that. I might leave that there, but let's adjust our y-axis. So axis options, numbers, nope, x-axis options, and maybe I should start around 400. Enter. Okay, so that gives us a much better representation of the spread of scores and the relationship between them two. We could put in a line of best fit if we wanted to. I tend to suggest that you shouldn't at this stage unless told otherwise. If you did want to put in your line of best fit, you could with the trend line, and there's other options there if you wanted to put in, say, your equations and your, there you go, so there's your equation on the chart, but not necessary at this stage, so we'll take those out and get rid of our trend line. But there is our APA formatted scatter plot.